In the vast emptiness of the Kharan Desert, where the sun burns mercy from men's hearts and water is worth more than gold, a girl named Zara stumbles through the sand dunes with death following close behind. Cast out by her own tribe for being too weak, too gentle, too soft for the harsh desert life, she has survived 3 days on nothing but thorns and morning dew. The raiders see her from a distance, an easy target, defenseless and alone. They ride hard, their horses kicking up clouds of sand, already dividing her few possessions among themselves. But they don't see the massive shadow that falls across her path, or the giant warrior who steps from behind the rocks with a sword as long as a man is tall. When he speaks, his voice carries the weight of mountains. My strength will protect your weakness. But can love truly bloom in a land where only the ruthless survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man who stood before Zara was a monument carved from living stone. Cowl towered above her diminutive frame, his shoulders broad enough to cast shade across her entire body. His skin bore the deep bronze of countless desert campaigns, and across his chest and arms ran a tapestry of scars, each one a story of survival, each one proof that he had faced death and walked away. His ears, dark as midnight pools, studied her with the careful assessment of a predator evaluating prey, yet something in their depths suggested he saw more than weakness. The sword in his massive hands gleamed like captured starlight, its edge worn smooth by use rather than neglect. This was not a ceremonial weapon, but a tool of war, and the ease with which he held its considerable weight spoke of strength that ran deeper than muscle. Zara clutched the desert rose crystal against her chest, the pink stone warm from her mother's final gift, still pulsing with faint heat. It was all she had left of the woman who had birthed her in defiance of tribal law, a healer who had loved a wandering merchant and paid the price with exile and early death. Now Zara carried both the crystal and the curse of gentleness that made her unfit for the sand viper tribe's harsh existence. The Kharan Desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of golden sand broken only by the occasional outcropping of red stone. Here water was life, and weakness was death. The tribes that survived did so through ruthless pragmatism, casting out the old, the sick, and the soft-hearted without ceremony or regret. Zara had learned this truth 3 sunrises ago, when the tribal elders had pointed toward the wasteland and spoken the words that severed all bonds: "The desert will judge your worth." She had expected to die with dignity as her mother had taught her. Instead, she had discovered reserves of stubborn will that kept her feet moving even when her water ran out, even when the sun blistered her pale skin, even when ravens circled overhead in patient anticipation. The irony was not lost on her that she had proven stronger in exile than she had ever been within the tribe's protection. Kel moved with the fluid grace of a natural killer, every step deliberate and balanced. His reputation preceded him across the desert like ripples in water. The ghost of the western reaches, the sword that never missed, the last of the Iron Legion that had once kept peace between the scattered tribes. Merchants spoke his name in whispers, either seeking his protection or praying to avoid his attention. But those who knew only the legends missed the subtle details that spoke of deeper complexity. The way his fingers gentled when adjusting his pack strap, the careful distance he maintained from others, not from arrogance, but from something that looked almost like shame. The methodical way he cleaned his weapons each evening, as if the ritual could somehow wash away the memories they had helped create. He had been wandering the deep desert for 3 years now, accepting contracts that took him far from populated areas, avoiding the questions that came with recognition. The massacre at Black Rock Canyon had broken something inside him that he wasn't sure could be repaired. His entire command, 50 of the finest warriors the desert had ever produced, betrayed by allies who had sold their loyalty to slave traders for gold and promises of power, Kale had survived only because he had been scouting ahead when the trap was sprung. He had returned to find his men crucified on wooden crosses, left to die slowly in the desert sun, as examples to any who might oppose the growing slave trade. The sight had driven him into a killing rage that lasted 3 days and left 200 enemies dead across the canyon floor. Since then, he had carried their deaths like stones in his chest, each memory a weight that bent his shoulders despite their considerable strength. He had been their leader, their protector, and he had failed them through trust misplaced in men who valued profit above honor. Now, looking at this fragile girl with her crystal clutched like a talisman and her eyes holding more courage than fear, he felt something stir that he had thought dead. She should have been broken by her exile, should have given up when the water ran low and the sun grew merciless. Instead, she stood straight, despite exhaustion, meeting his gaze without flinching. The desert had indeed judged her worth, and found her stronger than those who had cast her out. The raiders came like a sandstorm given flesh and malice. 5 men on horseback, their mounts lathered with sweat and foam, kicking up clouds of golden dust that caught the afternoon light. Their leader bore the crimson banner of the Bloodclaw clan on his spear, a torn piece of fabric that had been dipped in the blood of their victims and left to dry in the sun until it became as hard as leather. Zara had heard stories of the Bloodclaws around the tribal fire. They were slavers and murderers who preyed on the weak, selling captives to the flesh markets in the eastern cities or keeping the prettiest for their own amusement. The banner was more than mere decoration. It was a promise of what awaited those who fell into their hands. "Look what the desert has delivered to us," called their leader, a scarred man whose left eye had been replaced by a chunk of black obsidian. "Fresh meat, walking right into our arms." His companions laughed, the sound harsh as crow calls in the desert silence. They spread out in a practiced formation, cutting off any possible escape route with the casual efficiency of hunters who had performed this dance many times before. Their horses snorted and pawed the sand, eager for the chase that would follow once their riders had finished savoring the moment. Zara felt her knees begin to tremble, but she forced herself to remain standing. Her mother had taught her that dignity was the one thing that could never be taken from a person, only surrendered. If these men meant to break her, they would have to work for the privilege. "Please," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I have nothing of value. No gold, no jewels. I am cast out from my tribe." The leader's remaining eye gleamed with cruel amusement. "Oh, but you do have something of value, little desert flower. You have yourself." And in the slave markets of Kadesh, a young woman with all her teeth and no marks on her skin commands a fine price indeed. The raiders began to dismount, taking their time, savoring her terror. They had done this so many times that it had become a ritual, each man knowing his role in the performance. The leader would claim first rights, of course, but there would be enough sport for everyone before they trussed her up for the long journey to market. That was when the shadow fell across Zara, like the wings of some great bird of prey. Kal emerged from behind the rock, outcropping with the silence of smoke and the inevitability of death itself. His sword sang as it cleared its sheath, the blade catching the sun and throwing light in all directions like scattered diamonds. He moved with fluid precision, each step carrying him closer to the raiders who had been so focused on their prey that they had forgotten to watch for predators. 5 against 1, the leader sneered, though something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "Bad odds, stranger. Walk away while you still can." Khalil's response was a smile that held no warmth, only the promise of violence to come. "You're right about the odds," he said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had walked this path many times before. "They are bad indeed." The first raider died before his sword had fully cleared its sheath. Kyle's blade took him across the throat in a single fluid motion, opening his neck like a second mouth that poured crimson onto the sand. The man fell backward, his hands clutching at the wound as if he could somehow hold his life inside. The remaining 4 attacked together, shouting war cries meant to bolster their courage and terrify their enemy. They might as well have been children waving sticks at a sandstorm. Kyle flowed between their weapons like water, finding its path through stone, his sword moving in patterns too fast for the eye to follow. He severed one man's arm at the elbow, the limbs spinning through the air in a spray of blood. A backhand stroke opened another's belly, spilling his entrails onto the desert floor where they steamed in the heat. The third man lasted long enough to land a glancing blow on Kyle's shoulder before the great sword took his head clean off, sending it rolling across the sand like a child's ball. The leader, the man with the obsidian eye, found himself alone in the space of heartbeats. His banner, the crimson cloth that had struck terror into so many hearts, lay trampled in the bloody sand. He looked at Kyle with something approaching respect, recognizing a killer far superior to himself. "You fight like the old legends," he gasped, blood running from a dozen small cuts. "Like the Iron Legion." "I am the Iron Legion," Kyle replied, and drove his sword through the man's chest with surgical precision. The desert fell silent again, disturbed only by the buzzing of flies drawn by the scent of fresh blood. The silence that followed the slaughter stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Zara stood frozen, her eyes moving from the bodies scattered across the sand to the man who had created this crimson tableau with such terrifying ease. Blood dripped from Kyle's sword in a steady rhythm, each drop disappearing instantly into the thirsty desert floor. "Are you hurt?" His voice, so recently filled with deadly promise, now carried an unexpected gentleness that made Zara's breath catch in her throat. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Her hands trembled as she watched him clean his blade with methodical precision, wiping away the evidence of violence with movements that spoke of long practice. When he sheathed the weapon, the soft whisper of steel against leather seemed impossibly loud in the desert quiet. Kyle knelt beside the leader's body, his massive hands moving with surprising delicacy as he searched through the dead man's possessions. From a leather pouch at the raider's belt, he withdrew a small collection items, coins, a bone-handled knife, and a water skin that sloshed with precious liquid. They were well supplied, he observed, tossing the water skin to Zara. "Drink. You look like you haven't had water in days." The kindness in his gesture nearly broke her composure. Zara caught the water skin with shaking hands and drank deeply, feeling the blessed coolness flow down her parched throat. The water tasted of leather and metal, but it might as well have been the finest wine for the relief it brought. "Thank you," she whispered, lowering the skin and meeting his dark eyes. "But why? Why did you save me?" Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the carnage he had wrought with such casual efficiency. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and newer uncertainties. "Because someone should have saved them," he said finally. "My men, they died because I wasn't there when they needed me most. Perhaps saving you balances the scales just a little." Zara studied his face, noting the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of his lost comrades. She had heard whispers of the Iron Legion's fate, fragments of stories that painted their destruction as the blackest betrayal the desert had ever witnessed. Looking at this man, this legend made flesh, she could see how the weight of that failure had carved lines around his eyes and bent his shoulders, despite their obvious strength. "I don't think scales work that way," she said softly. "One life saved doesn't bring back 50 lives lost. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is simply that saving someone is the right thing to do." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Zara saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before the mask of controlled strength reasserted itself. He stood, brushing sand from his knees, and began gathering supplies from the other bodies. "The desert will claim them by morning," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Scavengers and sand. Nothing remains here for long except bones." "And us?" Zara asked, rising on unsteady legs. "What becomes of us?" Kyle paused in his methodical looting, a question she couldn't read passing through his eyes. "You're free to go wherever you choose. I've given you water and weapons. The nearest settlement is 3 days' walk to the south. But even as he spoke the words, they both knew the truth. Alone in the deep desert, she would die within hours of the sun's setting. The raiders had found her easily enough. Others would follow. Her exile from the Sandviper tribe had marked her as prey for every predator that stalked the dunes. "I could travel with you," she said, the words coming out in a rush, before courage could abandon her. "At least for a while. I won't slow you down, and I know things, useful things, plants that can heal wounds, stars that guide true, places where water hides beneath the sand." Kale studied her, with those midnight eyes, weighing her words against some internal calculation. She held her breath, knowing that his decision would mean the difference between life and death, between hope and despair. "I travel hard and sleep little," he warned. "I have enemies who would kill you simply for traveling in my company. The places I go, the things I do, they're not meant for gentle souls." "I'm stronger than I look," Zara replied, and something in her voice made him pause. "The desert has been testing me for days, and I'm still standing." After a long moment, he nodded once, the gesture sharp and decisive. "Then we travel together. But know this, little healer, my protection comes at a price. You'll see things that will give you nightmares. You'll witness violence that will sicken your gentle heart. And when that happens, when you decide you've had enough of walking in a killer's shadow, there will be no tears, no arguments. You'll go your way, and I'll go mine." Zara felt something inside her chest loosen and warm, like ice melting in spring sunshine. "I understand." But as they began walking into the desert's embrace, neither fully understood how completely their fates had become intertwined. The scorching wastes stretched before them like a vision of the underworld itself. Here, even the hardiest desert dwellers feared to tread, for this was where the sun's fury concentrated into something beyond mortal endurance. The sand beneath their feet radiated heat that penetrated through the soles of their boots, and the air shimmered with mirages that promised water where none existed. Kale had chosen this route deliberately. Few would follow them into this hellscape, and those foolish enough to try would likely perish long before they posed a threat. But even he had not anticipated how quickly the wasteland would test their newfound partnership. "Stop," Zara whispered, her hand shooting out to grasp his arm. Her touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, but her urgent tone focused his attention on the path ahead. The sand looked no different from any other stretch they had crossed, but something in her expression made him freeze mid-step. She knelt carefully, studying the ground with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. Her fingers hovered inches above the surface, never quite touching. "Sand vipers," she breathed. "A whole nest of them, just beneath the surface. See how the sand forms those tiny ridges? They're breathing vents. Step there, and we'll both be dead in minutes." Kel felt a chill despite the desert heat. He had walked battlefields, where death lurked in every shadow, but this was different. The desert's dangers were subtle, patient, requiring knowledge he did not possess. Without Zara's warning, he would have led them both into a tomb of fangs and venom. "How do we pass?" "We don't. We go around, far around. Sand vipers are territorial, but their territory has limits." She rose gracefully, her movements careful and deliberate. 3 miles to the east should see us clear." 3 miles meant precious time lost, precious water consumed, but Cal had not survived this long by ignoring good counsel. They altered course, giving the hidden nest a respectful distance, and he found himself watching her with new appreciation. The knowledge that had made her tribe consider her weak was proving invaluable in their survival. Hours later, as the sun reached its merciless peak, Zara called another halt. From her small pack, she withdrew what looked like an ordinary stone, smooth and dark as polished obsidian. But when she held it up to the light, it seemed to pulse with an inner glow that defied explanation. "My grandmother's water stone," she explained, seeing his questioning look. "The old magic, from before the tribes forgot the desert's true secret." Kale had heard whispers of such artifacts, relics from the time when the desert people had possessed powers that bordered on the mystical. Most dismissed such tales as fantasy, but watching Zara hold the stone aloft and slowly turn in a circle, he began to reconsider his skepticism. The stone's glow intensified when she faced northwest, pulsing like a heartbeat made visible. "Water," she said with quiet certainty. "Underground, but not far. Follow me." They dug where the stone's light was strongest, their hands burning against the superheated sand. 2 feet down, Kale's fingers encountered blessed moisture. 3 feet revealed a hidden spring, clear water bubbling up from depths unknown. They drank deeply, filled their water skins, and bathed their burned faces in liquid salvation. "How?" he asked, studying the stone as she tucked it back into her pack. "My grandmother said the desert remembers everything. The stones are its memory made solid, holding knowledge of every spring that ever flowed, every path that ever led to safety. The old blood can read them, if they know how to listen." That evening, as they made camp in the shelter of a wind-carved rock formation, the desert's fury turned from heat to violence. The sandstorm came without warning, a wall of stinging particles that turned day to night in moments. Wind howled like tortured spirits, and sand scoured exposed skin with the persistence of tiny knives. Kale pulled Zara against him, his broad back shielding her from the worst of the storm's assault. His cloak wrapped around them both, creating a pocket of relative calm in the chaos. She pressed close to his warmth, her slight frame trembling as much from exhaustion as from cold. "Tell me about the Iron Legion," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind's roar. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of ghosts, long unquiet. "We were brothers," he said simply. 50 men who had bled together, fought together, saved each other's lives more times than I could count. We believed in honor, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. We believed in each other. His arm tightened around her as a particularly vicious gust tried to tear away their shelter. "They trusted me to keep them safe. I failed them all. You couldn't have known about the betrayal. A leader's job is to know, to see the danger before it strikes. I was too trusting, too sure of our allies' honor." His voice turned bitter. "Honor is a luxury the dead cannot afford." Zara turned in his arms, her face inches from his in the cloth-wrapped darkness. "Then why did you save me? If honor is meaningless, why risk yourself for a stranger?" The question hung between them as the storm raged overhead, and Cal found himself without an answer that made sense, even to himself. The fever took hold of Kale on the second day after the sandstorm. It began as a slight tremor in his hands, barely noticeable except to eyes that had learned to watch him for signs of weakness. By midday, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the dry desert air, and his normally steady gait had developed an almost imperceptible weave. He said nothing, of course. Men like Kale did not acknowledge weakness, especially not to the fragile woman whose life depended on his strength. But Zara had tended enough sick people to recognize the signs, and when he finally stumbled and caught himself against a boulder, she knew they had reached the moment of crisis. "Sit," she commanded with an authority that surprised them both. "I'm fine," he growled, but the words lacked conviction. "Sit, or I'll find a way to make you sit." Despite himself, Kale almost smiled. The idea of this slip of a girl forcing him to do anything should have been laughable, but there was something in her tone that brooked no argument. He lowered himself onto a flat stone, and immediately felt the world tilt sideways. Zara knelt beside him, her small hands surprisingly gentle as she examined the wound on his shoulder, a cut from the raider's blade that he had dismissed as trivial. The flesh around the gash had turned an angry red, with dark lines beginning to spider outward along his arm. Infection, made worse by sand and sweat and the deliberate neglect of a man who had forgotten how to care for himself. From her healing pouch, she withdrew a collection of dried leaves and roots that looked like nothing more than desert refuse. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, crushing some herbs between stones, soaking others in precious water from their shared supply. The mixture she created smelled sharp and clean, like rain on heated stone. "This will hurt," she warned, meeting his eye. "Everything hurts." he replied, and for a moment she saw past his warrior's mask to the man beneath, tired, wounded, carrying burdens that no single person should bear. She cleaned the wound with ruthless thoroughness, ignoring his sharp intake of breath when the herbal mixture hit infected flesh. The pus that flowed out was thick and foul-smelling, evidence of how close he had come to serious danger. She worked, he began to speak, the fever loosening his tongue, in ways that conscious will never could. There was a medallion, he said, his voice distant with memory and pain. Bronze and silver, with the Legion's seal. Marcus gave it to me the day I made command, said it would bring me luck. His hand moved to his chest, fingers fumbling at a leather cord that disappeared beneath his shirt. When he pulled it free, Zara saw the broken remains of what had once been a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. The medallion had been shattered, its two halves held together by the chain alone. I broke it the day I found them, Cale continued, his eyes fixed on some distant horror only he could see. 50 good men, hung up like scarecrows for the crows to pick clean. They had trusted me to keep them safe, and I had led them into slaughter as surely as if I had swung the swords myself. You couldn't have known, Zara said softly, continuing her ministrations even as she listened to his pain pour out like blood from an opened vein. Couldn't I? His laugh held no humor. The signs were there. Questions about our patrol routes, requests for information about our supplies, men who had fought beside us for years, suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere when we needed them most. I ignored it all because I wanted to believe in honor, in brotherhood, in all the pretty lies that make war seem noble. She bound his wound with strips torn from her own clothing, the clean white fabric stark against his bronzed skin. The infection would break soon. Her grandmother's remedies rarely failed, but the deeper wounds, the ones that had nothing to do with flesh and blood, would take longer to heal. My mother died because she trusted the wrong man, Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. A merchant who promised to take her away from the tribe, to give her a better life in the cities. Instead, he took what he wanted and left her pregnant and alone in the desert. Cale's eyes focused on her face, fever bright but suddenly alert. The tribe cast her out. They let her stay until I was born. Then they made it clear that gentleness was a luxury they could not afford. One weak woman they could tolerate. A weak woman with a weak daughter was too much. Her hands stilled on his bandages. She died when I was 12. Consumption, the healers said, but I think she died of loneliness. Is that why you know so much about healing? You tended her, Zara nodded, and everyone else who would let me. The elders said I had the gift, but not the strength to use it properly. They were wrong about many things, but perhaps not about that. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Cal's fever had begun to break, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. He studied Zara's face in the dying light, noting the determined set of her jaw, the careful way she packed away her healing supplies. You're stronger than they knew, he said finally. So are you, she replied, and something in her voice made him wonder if she was talking about physical strength at all. The oasis appeared like a vision from another world, a jewel of impossible green nestled between towering walls of red sandstone. Ancient palms swayed in the evening breeze, their fronds whispering secrets in languages older than memory. Clear water bubbled up from hidden springs, forming pools so pure they reflected the sky like mirrors of liquid sapphire. Zara stopped at the oasis's edge and simply stared, her breath catching in her throat. After days of endless sand and merciless sun, this sanctuary seemed too beautiful to be real. Lotus blossoms floated on the water's surface, their white petals glowing in the fading light. Date palms heavy with fruit offered the promise of sweetness after days of bitter roots and dried meat. Is it safe? She whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow dispel the magic. Kel studied the guardian statue that stood sentinel beside the largest pool, a carved figure of black basalt, worn smooth by centuries of wind and sand. The statue depicted a woman with outstretched arms, her face serene despite the warrior's blade at her hip, and the healer's herbs in her other hand. Protective runes covered her base, symbols that predated the current tribes by generations uncounted. The old protections still hold, he said, recognizing marks he had learned from his grandfather, himself a keeper of ancient lore. This place is sacred to all desert peoples. Even the most ruthless raiders respect its sanctuary. They approached the sacred spring with the reverence due to holy ground. Zara knelt first, cupping the blessed water in her hands and drinking deeply. The liquid was cool and sweet, tasting of minerals and starlight and something indefinably pure. Kel followed her example, and for a moment both forgot the hardships of their journey in the simple pleasure of clean water and safety. The oasis was larger than it had appeared from outside, containing gardens that had been tended by countless hands over the centuries. Fig trees heavy with fruit grew alongside herbs that Zara recognized from her grandmother's teachings. Someone had planted jasmine around the sacred spring, and its perfume filled the evening air with sweetness. People have been caring for this place for generations, Zara observed, running her fingers along the carefully maintained stone channels that directed water to different garden plots. Travelers like us, probably, each one leaving it a little better than they found it. They made camp beneath the palms, using fallen fronds to create a shelter that felt more like a home than anywhere either had rested in years. For the first time since they had begun traveling together, they could truly relax, knowing that the sanctuary's ancient protections would keep them safe through the night. As darkness fell, the oasis revealed new wonders. Flowers that had remained closed during the heat of day opened to release fragrances that made the night air itself seem alive. Somewhere in the gardens, a nightingale began its song, the pure notes floating across the water like prayers made audible. Zara sat beside the sacred spring, her feet dangling in the warm water, watching silver fish dart between the lotus stems. The stress and fear of their desert crossing seemed to melt away in this place of peace, leaving her feeling lighter than she had in months. When she looked at Kale, she saw that the same transformation had touched him. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked truly at rest. "I had forgotten," he said softly, his voice carrying wonder like a man discovering color after years of seeing only gray. "Forgotten what? That places like this exist, that beauty can survive in a world full of ugliness, that there are still sacred things worth protecting." He moved to sit beside her at the spring's edge, his massive frame somehow graceful in the starlight. The guardian statue watched over them both, her carved face serene and knowing, as if she had witnessed countless such moments of peace between weary travelers. "When I was a child," Zara said, "my mother told me stories about the old times, when the desert bloomed with gardens like this one. She said that love was like water in the wasteland, precious and rare, but capable of making anything grow if you tended it carefully enough." Carl turned to look at her, really look at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The moonlight turned her hair to silver and her skin to pearl, but it was the expression in her eyes that made his breath catch open. Trusting, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical features and everything to do with the soul that shone through them. "Zara," he said, her name a question and a prayer all at once. She leaned toward him, drawn by something deeper than desire, deeper than loneliness. When their lips met beneath the stars, it felt like coming home to a place neither had known they were searching for. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it deepened as they both realized that what they had found in each other was worth any risk, any danger. The sacred spring sang around them, and the guardian statue kept her eternal watch, blessing love that bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Dawn broke with the soft whisper of steel against leather as Kel checked his weapons, a ritual he had performed every morning for more years than he cared to count. But this morning was different. This morning, the woman who had claimed a place in his heart still slept peacefully beneath the palms, her face serene in the golden light filtering through the leaves. He had not meant for it to happen. Love was a luxury he could not afford, a weakness that his enemies would exploit without mercy. Yet watching Zara sleep, seeing the trust written in every line of her relaxed form, he found he could not regret the choice his heart had made without consulting his mind. She stirred as he moved about their small camp, her eyes opening to find him already dressed and armed for travel. The sight of his preparations brought the harsh realities of their situation rushing back, banishing the peaceful magic of their night in sanctuary. "We should stay another day," she said softly, sitting up and smoothing her hair with fingers that trembled slightly. "Rest, gather supplies, let your wound heal completely." Kel wanted nothing more than to agree, to spend another day in this paradise where the outside world could not touch them. But survival had taught him to recognize when safety was becoming a trap. "We've stayed too long already," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Places like this draw all kinds of travelers. Some of them won't be friendly." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Kel was moving before the hoofbeats had fully registered, positioning himself between Zara and the oasis entrance, while his hand found the familiar grip of his sword. "Stay behind the guardian statue," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in matters of life and death. The riders who entered the oasis were cut from different cloth than the raiders they had encountered before. These men wore the fine silks and gold jewelry of successful merchants, their horses groomed and well-fed, their weapons of the highest quality. But their eyes held the cold calculation of predators who had learned to dress their cruelty in civilized clothing. Their leader was a thin man with a carefully groomed beard and fingers heavy with rings. The brand he carried, an iron rod with an intricate design at its tip, marked him as a slave trader of the highest order. This was no crude raider, snatching whatever victims he could find. This was a businessman who dealt in human flesh with the same casual efficiency others might use to trade in spices or silk. "Well, well," the leader said, his cultured voice at odds with the brutality of his profession. "What have we here?" A warrior and his pretty companion, playing at being lovers in paradise. Carl said nothing, but his stance shifted subtly, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to explode into violence at the first sign of threat. The slave traders spread out in a practiced formation, but they showed more caution than the raiders had. Word traveled fast in the desert, and tales of the massacre near the scorching wastes had already begun to spread. "You know who I am," the leader continued, studying Carl with the appraising eye of a man who made his living evaluating human assets. "And I believe I know who you are as well. The ghost of the Western Reaches, the last of the Iron Legion. Quite a reputation you've built for yourself. Leave now," Carl said quietly, "and you can keep your lives." The slave trader laughed, a sound like silver bells over an open grave. "Oh, I think not. You see, my friend, you've cost me quite a bit of money recently. Those raiders you butchered, they were under contract to me. And the girl," his eyes found Zara, where she crouched behind the guardian statue. "Well, she's exactly the sort of merchandise my Eastern clients pay premium prices for." "You're welcome to try taking her," Carl replied, and his smile was the sort that made wise men reconsider their life choices. The attack came without warning. The slave traders were professionals who had survived in their brutal trade by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than their prey. They moved like a pack of wolves, coordinated and deadly, using nets and weighted ropes designed to capture rather than kill. But they had never faced anything like Kyle in full fury. The man who had once been called the Ghost moved through their ranks like his namesake, deadly and untouchable. His sword sang through the morning air, painting the sacred grove with crimson as he carved through their formation with surgical precision. One trader got past his guard, diving toward Zara with a weighted net. She screamed, not in fear, but in warning, as the man's weapon spread wide to engulf her. But Kyle was already moving, crossing the distance between them in 3 impossibly long strides. The trader died with Kyle's blade through his heart, his net falling harmlessly to the ground. The leader, seeing his men scattered and dying, raised his iron brand like a weapon and charged with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Kyle caught the branding iron in his bare hand, ignoring the smell of his own flesh burning, and drove his sword through the slave trader's silk-clad chest with mechanical precision. The oasis fell silent, except for the gentle sound of water flowing over stone, and Zara's ragged breathing as she emerged from behind the guardian statue. The sacred grove was defiled now, stained with blood and death, its peace shattered by the violence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. "We need to leave," Kyle said, flexing his burned hand and wincing at the pain. Now, Kaiser and Nohis rose from the desert like a fever dream made manifest in brass and stone. The city of brass sprawled across a natural depression between three towering mesas, its golden walls catching the morning sun and throwing back light so brilliant it hurt to look upon directly. Minarets twisted skyward like frozen flames, and the air above the city shimmered with heat and the smoke of countless forges. This was the greatest trading hub of the Eastern Desert, where caravans from a dozen kingdoms converged to exchange goods, information, and coin. The city's wealth was legendary, built on the backs of merchants who cared nothing for the source of their prosperity so long as the gold continued to flow like water through their coffers. Zara pulled her borrowed cloak tighter around her shoulders, the rich silk killed strange against skin more accustomed to rough desert cloth. The transformation had been Kale's idea. If they were to enter the city unnoticed, they needed to look like wealthy travelers rather than desert refugees. From the slave trader's possessions, he had assembled a convincing disguise, fine robes, jewelry, even a small purse of gold coins to lend credibility to their story. "Remember," he said softly as they approached the massive gates, "you are Yasmin bint Ahmed, daughter of a spice merchant from the Western Kingdoms. I am your bodyguard, hired by your father to protect you on this trading expedition." The irony was not lost on either of them. Here, in this den of slavers and profiteers, the gentle healer would play the role of pampered nobility, while the legendary warrior posed as hired muscle. But the disguise served its purpose. The gate guards barely glanced at them before waving them through with bored indifference. Inside the city walls, Kharan Desert assaulted the senses with its chaotic vitality. The main bazaar stretched for acres, a maze of stalls and shops selling everything from rare spices to exotic silks to weapons forged in distant lands. The air thrummed with conversation in a dozen languages, punctuated by the calls of merchants hawking their wares and the musical chime of coins changing hands. At the heart of it all sat the golden merchant scale, a massive artifact of brass and precious metals that dominated the central square like a shrine to commerce itself. Legend claimed it had been forged by Jinn in ages past, that its measurements were always true and its judgment final in matters of trade. More practically, it served as a symbol of the city's power. Everything here could be bought and sold, weighed and measured, reduced to its essential value in gold. Zara found herself staring at the scale with fascination and revulsion in equal measure. The craftsmanship was undeniably beautiful, its golden plates perfectly balanced, its supporting pillars carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift and flow in the flickering torchlight. But she could not forget that this same instrument had likely been used to weigh human lives, to calculate the worth of men and women torn from their homes and sold like cattle. "Stay close," Kale murmured, his voice barely audible over the crowd's noise, "and remember your role." They made their way through the bazaar with the careful attention of tourists, stopping at stalls that sold nothing more dangerous than carved trinkets and sweet pastries. But Kale's trained eye catalogued details that would escape casual notice, the subtle signs that marked certain merchants as more than simple traders, the careful way guards positioned themselves at key intersections, the particular quality of silence that fell when certain names were mentioned. It was at a fabric stall, while Zara examined bolts of silk with convincing interest, that they first heard whispers of what they had come to investigate. Two merchants spoke in low voices behind a curtain of hanging tapestries, their words carefully chosen but their meaning clear to those who knew how to listen. "The next shipment arrives before the new moon," said one, his voice carrying the nasal accent of the northern city. 50 head, all young and healthy. The eastern buyers are already making inquiries. Good quality? Asked his companion, a fat man whose fingers sparkled with rings. The last batch was disappointing. Too much spirit, not enough training. These ones have been properly broken. The supplier knows his business. Kale's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his sword hilt, but his expression remained neutral. Beside him, Zara continued her examination of the silk, though he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she controlled her breathing. They moved on before their eavesdropping could be noticed, but both carried the weight of what they had heard. 50 souls, reduced to livestock in the calculations of men who traded in human misery. The knowledge sat like poison in their bellies, a reminder of why places like Qasr al-Nuhas thrived, while good people suffered in the desert's embrace. We need information, Kale said quietly, as they paused before a stall selling ornate daggers. Names, routes, schedules. If we're going to stop this, we need to know when and where they plan to strike. Zara nodded, her fingers trailing over the silk scarves she had purchased to maintain their cover. There are others here who oppose this trade. I can feel it. People who remember when this city was more than a marketplace for human flesh. The question was whether they could find these allies before their enemies found them. The underground meeting took place in the basement of an old spice warehouse, where the heavy scents of cinnamon and cardamom masked the smell of fear and desperation that clung to those who dared oppose the city's most profitable trade. Flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, and the only sound was the nervous shifting of bodies and the distant rumble of carts passing overhead. Kale counted 12 people in the cramped space, merchants whose consciences had finally overcome their greed, former slaves who had bought their freedom, and now worked to free others, city guards, who had grown sick of looking the other way. They were a motley collection of revolutionaries, united only by their hatred of the slave trade that had corrupted their city. The group's leader was a woman named Farah, whose lined face and silver hair spoke of decades spent fighting battles that others preferred to ignore. Her hands bore the calluses of honest work, and her eyes held the hard light of someone who had seen too much suffering to ever look away again. The next raid targets the Moonrise Oasis, she said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge. 2 days from now, just after sunset. The slavers know the summer gathering will bring together 5 different tribes, easy pickings for those with enough men and no scruples. Zara felt her blood turn to ice water. The Moonrise Oasis was sacred ground, a place where the scattered desert peoples came together to trade, arrange marriages, and share news. It was neutral territory, protected by ancient laws that even the most ruthless raiders had always respected. How many? Kale asked, his voice deadly quiet. 60 mounted fighters, led by Ibn Rashad himself, Farah replied. They'll strike fast, take the youngest and strongest, and be gone before the tribes can organize a defense. The name Ibn Rashad sent murmurs of fear through the assembled group. He was the most successful slaver in the eastern desert, a man who had turned human trafficking into an art form. Unlike the crude raiders who snatched random victims, Ibn Rashad planned his operations with military precision, striking when and where his targets were most vulnerable. We have to warn them, Zara said, her diplomatic training asserting itself despite the personal stakes involved. Send riders to the tribes, tell them to scatter before the slavers arrive. An old man named Hassan shook his head sadly. And accomplish what? The tribes will disperse. Yes, but they'll reform somewhere else. Ibn Rashad will simply wait and strike again when they're not expecting it. We'll have bought time, nothing more. Then what do you propose? Kale asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. We stop them, Farah said simply. Meet them at the oasis and make it clear that this trade will no longer be tolerated. The silence that followed her words was heavy with the implications. 12 people, most of them civilians, against 60 professional fighters, led by one of the most dangerous men in the desert. It was suicide, disguised as heroism, I can help, Zara said quietly, and every eye in the room turned to her. I know those tribes. They know me. If I can reach the gathering before Ibn Rashad strikes, I might be able to convince them to stand and fight instead of running. And I know Ibn Rashad's tactics, Kale added, his scarred hand unconsciously moving to touch the broken medallion at his throat. He's good, but he's not invincible. With the right plan, the right positioning. Their words hung in the air like a promise and a prayer. Hope, fragile as desert flowers, began to bloom in faces that had known too much despair. It was then that the gift arrived, a small package wrapped in silk and tied with golden ribbon, delivered by a street boy who vanished into the crowd before anyone could question him. Farah unwrapped it with careful fingers, revealing an ornate ring set with a deep blue stone that seemed to pulse within a light. Beautiful, she murmured, slipping it onto her finger to examine it more closely. But who would send such a thing? The answer came within moments. Farah's eyes widened in shock, then rolled back to show only whites. Her body convulsed once, twice, and then went still as stone. The ring on her finger continued to pulse with that hypnotic blue light, but its wearer would never see anything again. Poison, Hassan whispered, backing away from the body, as if death might be contagious. Someone knew about this meeting. Panic rippled through the group like wildfire. If their enemies knew about this gathering, knew enough to target their leader with such precision, then none of them were safe. The careful network of resistance they had built over months of patient work was compromised, perhaps fatally. "We scatter," said a young merchant, his voice high with fear. "Go to ground, wait for this to pass." "No," Kel said, his voice cutting through the rising hysteria like a blade through silk. "That's what they want. They kill one of us, and the rest run like rabbits. We stick to the plan." "The plan was Farah's," Hassan protested. "She's dead." "Then we make a new plan," Zara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Farah died believing we could stop this. Are we going to prove her wrong?" The poisoned ring caught the lamplight, its blue stone winking like a malevolent eye, a reminder that their enemies were closer than they had dared imagine. The inn-room was small and sparse, containing nothing but a narrow bed, a cracked wash-basin, and a single window that looked out over the city's maze of twisting alleys. But it felt like a palace to two people who had spent so many nights sleeping on sand beneath stars. And more importantly, it offered them privacy to speak freely for the first time since entering Kasu. Zara sat on the edge of the bed, her borrowed finery discarded in favor of the simple desert clothes that felt more like her true self. Her silver hairpin, the one beautiful thing she owned, a gift from her mother on her 16th birthday, lay on the rough wooden table beside the wash-basin. The delicate ornament looked impossibly fragile in this place of violence and betrayal, a reminder of gentleness in a world that had forgotten its value. "They'll be watching us now," Kel said, checking the window's view of the street below. "After what happened to Farah, they know we're more than simple merchants. Do you regret it?" Zara asked, quietly. "Getting involved in this fight? It would be easier to simply leave the city, find some distant place where the slave trade can't reach us." Kel turned from the window to study her face in the lamplight. The question hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread, sharp enough to cut through all the careful barriers they had built around their growing feelings. "3 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation," he admitted, settling beside her on the bed's edge. "I would have taken my coin, bought supplies, and disappeared into the deep desert where other people's troubles couldn't follow. And now I look at you, and I see something worth protecting. Not just you personally, though the gods know that's true enough, but what you represent. The idea that gentleness can exist alongside strength, that someone can care about strangers suffering even when they have troubles of their own." His scarred hand found hers, fingers intertwining with surprising tenderness. "You asked me once why I saved you from those raiders. I told you it was about balancing scales, about making up for the men I failed to protect. But that wasn't the whole truth." Zara's breath caught as she saw something vulnerable and precious flickering in his dark eyes. "What was the truth?" "The truth is that from the moment I saw you standing there in the desert, refusing to beg for mercy even when death was breathing down your neck, I knew you were someone who would change my life. I was terrified of that change, fought against it with everything I had, but it happened anyway." He lifted their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I saved you because even then, some part of me understood that saving you might be the first step towards saving myself." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge, spanning an impossible chasm. Zara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of a truth too large to hold in her chest. "I love you," she whispered, the words falling from her lips like water in the desert, precious, life-giving, impossible to take back once spilled. "And I love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion he had spent years learning to suppress. "Which is why I'm so afraid of what's coming. The raid, everything. This fight with the slavers, the enemies we're making, the danger we're walking into. I've lost everyone I ever cared about, Zara. My men, my brothers in arms, all of them died because I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, careful enough to keep them safe." His grip on her hand tightened until it was almost painful. "I can't lose you too. I won't survive it a second time." Zara turned to face him fully, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. The gesture was tender but firm, demanding his attention with gentle insistence. "Then don't lose me," she said simply. "Don't push me away because you're afraid of what might happen. Don't treat me like something fragile that needs to be protected from the world. I chose this path, Kiel. I chose you, trust me, to be strong enough for that choice. You don't understand what these people are capable of. I understand perfectly." Her voice carried a steel core wrapped in silk. "They took my mother from me before I was old enough to fight back. They cast me out to die in the desert because they thought weakness was contagious. They've built their wealth on the broken backs of people who never had a choice in their suffering." She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his, their breath mingling in the small space between their faces. "But I also understand something they don't. Love isn't weakness, Kiel. It's the strongest force in the world when it's shared between two people who refuse to be broken." The kiss that followed was different from their first. Beneath the oasis stars, that had been discovery, wonder, the gentle exploration of new possibilities. This was claiming, confirmation, the forging of bonds that would hold against whatever storms might come. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the lamp had burned low and the sounds of the city's nightlife drifted through the window like distant music. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough to make them feel invincible. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from witnessing something too horrible to forget. Hassan had sent him the old resistance member, who had taken unofficial leadership after Farah's murder. The boy could barely speak through his exhaustion, but his message was clear enough. The slave raids had begun early. 3 settlements hit in the night. The messenger gasped, accepting the water cup Zara pressed into his trembling hands. "The Crying Rocks, Jasmine Wells, and the Old Merchant's Rest. Ibn Rashad isn't waiting for the moonrise gathering. He's striking everywhere at once." Cal felt his blood turn to ice. This was not the plan they had prepared for, not the careful, calculated strike they had hoped to intercept. This was wholesale slaughter, a coordinated assault designed to sweep up every available victim before anyone could organize resistance. "How many taken?" Zara asked, though the expression on her face suggested she dreaded the answer. "Over 200 souls," the boy whispered. "Men, women, children, anyone strong enough to survive the journey to the eastern markets. The rest," he shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. "The rest were dead, of course. The old, the sick, the very young who would not fetch good prices. They were nothing but obstacles to be cleared away, their lives snuffed out with the casual efficiency of men harvesting grain." But it was the messenger's next words that truly shattered their carefully laid plans. "The Sandviper tribe was among those hit. Your people, lady, they fought hard, but there were too many raiders. The survivors are being held at the old fortress ruins near Dead Man's Canyon." Zara's face went white as bleached bone. "The Sandviper tribe, the people who had cast her out, yes, but also the people who had raised her, taught her, been the only family she had ever known. Her hands shook as she set down her own water cup, the clay vessel rattling against the wooden table. "We have to help them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute determination. "Zara," Kyle began carefully, recognizing the dangerous light in her eyes, "we can't save everyone. If we spread ourselves too thin, those are my people." The words came out flat and hard, brooking no argument. "They may have rejected me, but I will not reject them. Not when they're suffering because I wasn't there to help defend them." Kyle understood the guilt driving her decision. He had felt the same crushing weight after his men's massacre, the terrible certainty that somehow, if he had been present, things would have turned out differently. It was a lie the heart told itself to make sense of. Senseless tragedy, but it was a lie that could drive good people to heroic foolishness. "Dead Man's Canyon is a fortress," he said, trying to inject reason into a situation that had moved far beyond rational planning. High walls, narrow approaches, perfect defensive positions. Ibn Rashad chose it precisely because it's nearly impossible to assault. "Nearly impossible isn't the same as completely impossible," Zara replied, and something in her tone reminded him that this gentle healer was also a woman who had survived exile in the deep desert through sheer stubborn will. From the messenger's pack, Hassan had sent along more than just news. Wrapped in oiled cloth was an ancient war horn, its surface carved with symbols that predated the current kingdoms by centuries. The artifact was made from the horn of some great beast, polished smooth by countless hands, and inscribed with runes that seemed to shift and flow in the changing light. "Hassan said you'd know what this means," the messenger explained, unwrapping the horn with reverent care. "He said to tell you that the old alliances still hold, if someone has the courage to sound the call." Kale stared at the artifact with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He had heard stories of such horns from his grandfather, tales of the ancient days when the desert tribes could put aside their differences and unite against common threats. The horn was said to carry a sound that could reach across vast distances, calling warriors to battle and binding them with oaths older than memory. "If we sound that," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Every tribe that hears it will know that someone has called for war against the slavers. They'll come, but they'll expect leadership, strategy, victory." "Then we give them leadership," Zara said, lifting the horn with both hands. The ancient artifact felt warm to her touch, as if it contained some spark of the fierce spirits who had carried it into battle across the centuries. "We give them strategy," Kale added, his warrior's mind already beginning to calculate possibilities, to see patterns in the chaos that civilian eyes would miss. "And we give them victory," they said together, their voices blending like a vow spoken before the gods themselves. But as Zara raised the ancient horn to her lips, both of them understood that victory would demand a price. Neither was fully prepared to pay. The war horn's call would summon allies, yes, but it would also announce their presence to every enemy within 100 miles. They were about to paint targets on their backs that would never fade. The horn's voice, when it came, was deeper than thunder and wilder than the wind, carrying across the desert like the cry of some primordial beast awakening from ancient slumber. They came from across the desert like ghosts materializing from heat mirages, warriors who had heard the ancient call and could not ignore the bonds of blood and honor that transcended tribal boundaries. The war horn's voice had carried farther than anyone had dared hope, reaching into the deep places where the proudest fighters made their home. The gathering point was a natural amphitheater, carved from red sandstone, hidden in the whispering hills where ancient winds had sculpted the rock into fantastic shapes. Here, beneath stars that had witnessed 1,000 such councils, the scattered tribes of the desert came together as their ancestors had done in the old days, when survival depended on unity. Zara stood at the center of the circle, the sacred council firebrand burning in her hand like a captured piece of the sun itself. The torch had been passed from chieftain to chieftain for generations uncounted, its flame never allowed to die completely. Tonight it burned brighter than it had in decades, fed by wood from trees that grew only in the deepest desert oases. Around her, in concentric rings that reflected the ancient protocols of intertribal gathering, sat the leaders who had answered the horn's call. Shai Hamid of the Golden Eagles, his face marked by ritual scars that told the story of his victories. Chieftain Miriam of the Star Dancers, her silver hair braided with tokens from every battle she had fought. Old Hassan of the Stone Wolves, whose tribe was small but whose counsel was valued above that of mightier clans. There were others too, young war leaders eager to prove themselves, grizzled veterans who had seen too much bloodshed to hunger for more. Even a few representatives from the city-dwelling merchants who had finally recognized that the slave trade threatened everyone, not just the desert nomad. "You all know why we are here," Zara began, her voice carrying clearly in the desert's stillness. The woman who had once been considered too gentle for tribal life now commanded attention with the quiet authority of someone who had proven herself through trial and suffering. Ibn Rashad has broken the oldest laws of the desert. He has violated sacred ground, enslaved those under guest protection, murdered children and elders whose only crime was existing in the path of his greed. He has declared war on everything we hold sacred, and we must answer that declaration. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, not of disagreement, but of recognition. They had all heard the stories, seen the evidence of the slave raid's brutality. The time for half measures and cautious responses had passed. But unity of purpose means nothing without unity of action, continued Sheikh Ahmad, his deep voice resonating with the authority of one who had led men into battle for 30 years. We are 7 different tribes with 7 different ways of fighting. How do we forge one weapon from 7 different metals? It was Kal who answered, stepping forward into the firelight, with the careful confidence of a man who had spent his life solving exactly such problems. We use our differences as strengths rather than weaknesses. The Golden Eagles are the finest cavalry in the desert. They lead our mounted charges. The Star Dancers know every hidden path through the canyon country. They guide our flanking movement. The Stone Wolves have never met a fortification they couldn't breach. They show us how to crack Ibn Rashad's defenses. He moved around the circle as he spoke, meeting each leader's eyes, acknowledging their particular skills and history. It was a masterful performance, the kind of inspirational leadership that had made the Iron Legion legendary throughout the desert. "And what of those who are not warriors born?" asked Chieftain Miriam, her sharp eyes finding Zara in the flickering firelight. "The healers, the merchants, the young ones who have never held a sword. They are the reason we fight," Zara replied without hesitation. "And they will be crucial to our victory. Every healer means wounded fighters who return to the battle rather than dying in the sand. Every merchant knows routes and hiding places that warriors might miss. Every young person represents the future we're trying to protect." The council fire crackled higher, and in its light, old enemies saw each other clearly for the first time in years. The Sunset Raiders and the Dune Serpents, who had feuded over water rights for 3 generations, sat side by side and planned coordinated attacks. The Mountain Claws and the Wind Riders, whose territorial disputes had cost dozens of lives, shared maps and intelligence with the trust of blood brothers. "There is something else," announced a new voice from the edge of the circle. The speaker was a young woman barely past her 20th year, but her clothes marked her as a member of the Sand Viper tribe, Zara's own people, though her face was unfamiliar. "My name is Layla," she continued, stepping into the firelight with visible nervousness. "I escaped when the slavers hit our settlement. I bring word from the prisoners held at Dead Man's Canyon." The entire assembly fell silent, hanging on her every word. "They know you're coming," Layla said, her voice gaining strength as she delivered her crucial message. "Ibn Rashad has spies everywhere. He's expecting an attack, and he's ready for it. But," she paused, gathering her courage, "the prisoners are ready too. They've been organizing, preparing. When your assault begins, they'll fight from within the fortress walls." The revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered warriors. A coordinated attack from outside while the prisoners rose in revolt from within. It could turn an impossible siege into a winnable battle, but it also meant that failure would cost far more than military defeat. If they failed, every prisoner who had dared to hope for rescue would pay the ultimate price for that hope. Dawn came to Dead Man's Canyon with the sound of steel singing against leather as Kale drew his father's sword for what he knew might be the final time. The blade was a masterwork of the old smiths, forged in the days when the desert kingdoms had been united under a single banner. 3 feet of perfectly balanced steel, its edge honed to razor sharpness, its fuller engraved with runes that spoke of honor, duty, and the price of both. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather before passing to his father, and from his father to him on the day he had taken command of the Iron Legion. It had tasted the blood of 100 battles, had carved victory from the teeth of defeat more times than he could count. Today, it would either add Ibn Rashad's death to its long tally, or it would find a new bearer among the survivors. "Remember," he called softly to the warriors crouched in the pre-dawn shadows around him, "we strike hard and fast. No mercy for the slavers, but any prisoner who surrenders is to be spared and protected. We're here to save lives, not take them needlessly." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its execution. 3 coordinated strikes. The Golden Eagle's cavalry would charge the main gate to draw attention and break the first line of defense. The Star Dancers would scale the canyon walls to attack from above, and Kale would lead a mixed force through the old water channels that fed the fortress's cisterns. But even the best plans became chaos once the fighting started, and Kale had lived through enough battles to know that victory would ultimately depend on individual courage and the favor of whatever gods watched over desperate causes. The signal came as the sun cleared the canyon rim, a hawk's cry that might have been natural if one didn't know to listen for it. Immediately the desert exploded into violence as 200 warriors emerged from hiding places that had taken them half the night to reach. Shah-e-Gamad's cavalry struck first, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth of the canyon floor. The Golden Eagles rode like the wind given form and purpose, their lances glittering in the morning sun as they crashed into the slavers' outer defenses with the force of a sandstorm made flesh. The fortress walls erupted in confusion as Ibn Rashad's men scrambled to respond to the attack. Crossbow bolts filled the air like deadly rain, and cauldrons of boiling oil began to pour from the battlements. But the slavers had grown lazy and confident, unprepared for the coordinated fury of united tribes who had put aside generations of feuds to stand together. Kale led his strike force through the ancient drainage tunnels, crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, while above them the sounds of battle grew louder and more desperate. The tunnels were older than the fortress itself, carved by forgotten hands in an age when this canyon had been a place of pilgrimage rather than imprisonment. They emerged in the fortress courtyard like avenging spirits, taking the slavers from behind while their attention was focused on the walls. Kale's father's sword moved like liquid lightning, cutting down 3 men before they could even draw their weapons. Around him, his companions fought with the desperate precision of people who knew that failure meant not just death, but the enslavement of everyone they loved. The battle reached its crescendo when the Star Dancers completed their impossible climb, appearing on the fortress walls like acrobats from a fever dream. They rappelled down into the courtyard on ropes woven from desert grass, their curved blades singing as they carved through the slavers' ranks. But it was the uprising of the prisoners themselves that turned the tide from victory to rout. Led by survivors from the Sandviper tribe, they had fashioned weapons from chains and broken pottery, turning their very chains into instruments of liberation. When the fortress gates finally fell, it was not just to external assault, but to internal rebellion. Zara found her people in the deepest cells, where Ibn Rashad had kept his most valuable prisoners. Her former tribal elders, the same men who had cast her into exile, looked up at her approach with expressions of shame and wonder. "Little flower," whispered Elder Hassan, using the pet name he had called her as a child. "You came back for us." able to protect without becoming hardened by the violence that protection sometimes requires. He will be, Zara assured him, her hand covering his where it rested on the baby's chest. Because he'll have both of us to teach him. Your strength and my gentleness, your courage and my wisdom. He'll learn that true power lies in choosing when to fight and when to heal. Through the window they could see the settlement they had built spreading out in the valley below. The healing center was already famous throughout the region, drawing patients from kingdoms beyond the desert's borders. The training grounds echoed daily with the sounds of young warriors learning to fight as unified forces rather than tribal competitors. Most satisfying of all was the sight of the merchant caravans that had begun using their settlement as a regular stop. Trade was flowing freely again, but now it was honest trade, goods and services exchanged fairly, with no tolerance for the human trafficking that had once poisoned the desert's commerce. "Look there," Zara said, nodding toward the window where a group of children played in the plaza's fountain. Among them were former slaves who had found new families among the settlers, tribal outcasts who had discovered acceptance in their community, and the children of warriors who were growing up, knowing that strength could be used to protect rather than dominate. "That's our real legacy," she continued, watching the children splash and laugh in the afternoon sun. "Not just our son, but all of them. Every child who grows up in a world where gentleness and strength aren't enemies, where protecting the weak is honored above conquering the strong." A soft knock at the door interrupted their contemplation. Elder Hassan entered, moving carefully on legs that had grown stiff with age but eyes that still sparkled with keen intelligence. He carried a small bundle wrapped in silk, which he presented to them with the formal ceremony due to such occasions. "A gift from the 7 tribes," he announced, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a collection of small items: a silver rattle from the Star Dancers, a wooden toy horse from the Golden Eagles, a tiny sword carved from blessed wood by the Stone Wolves. Each tribe had contributed something to welcome the newest member of their extended desert family. "The council has also reached a decision," Hassan continued, his voice carrying the weight of official proclamation. "Your son will be considered a child of all tribes, with the right to claim hospitality and protection from any of our peoples. He will grow up knowing that the desert itself is his heritage." As if sensing the importance of the moment, the baby opened his dark eyes and gazed up at the faces surrounding him with the serene curiosity of someone discovering the world for the first time. In that gaze, both parents saw reflections of their own hopes and dreams, but also something entirely new, potential unlimited by the scars and limitations that had shaped their own lives. "What shall we call him?" Kil asked, though he already knew the answer they had chosen together during the long months of preparation. "Amir," Zara replied, speaking the name that meant prince in the old tongue. Prince of the desert, child of love, bridge between what was and what could be. 5 years had passed since the battle at Dead Man's Canyon, and the desert had bloomed under the influence of love made manifest in stone and growing things. Where the old maps showed only empty wasteland between tribal territories, travelers now marked the location of New Haven, the settlement that had grown from a young couple's dream into a beacon of hope for all who wandered the harsh places of the world. The desert rose garden was Zara's masterpiece, a living testament to the truth that beauty could flourish in the most unlikely places. She had coaxed the rare flowers from soil that had known only thorns and bitter herbs, nurturing them with patience and the kind of gentle persistence that could move mountains one grain of sand at a time. Now the roses bloomed in profusion, their pink petals soft as silk, and their fragrance sweet enough to perfume the entire valley when evening winds stirred their branches. Kel stood among the roses in the early morning light, watching his son play with wooden toys carved by tribal craftsmen from a dozen different kingdoms. At 5 years old, Amir had already grown tall for his age, showing promise of inheriting his father's impressive stature. But his gentle manner with the garden's small creatures revealed his mother's influence as well. "Papa, look!" Amir called out, his voice bright with excitement, as he pointed toward a butterfly that had landed on one of the rose blooms. The creature's wings were iridescent blue and gold, colors so vivid they seemed to glow with inner light. Beautiful, isn't Kale replied, kneeling beside his son to better appreciate the small miracle. Your mama says butterflies are proof that the most amazing transformations are possible with patience and time. It was true in ways that extended far beyond the natural world. The butterfly visiting their garden was just one small sign of the larger transformation that had swept across the region. Where slave caravans had once moved under cover of darkness, now merchant trains traveled freely under the protection of tribal guards who had learned to work together. Where fear had once kept isolated communities suspicious of strangers, now trade routes bustled with honest commerce and cultural exchange. The healing center had grown beyond anything they had originally envisioned. What had started as Zara's simple wish to help the wounded had evolved into a complex of buildings where healers from every tradition came to share knowledge and refine their arts. Patients traveled from the furthest reaches of the known world, drawn not just by the quality of care, but by the revolutionary idea that healing should be available to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. The warrior training grounds told a similar story of growth and evolution. Young fighters still came to learn the arts of war, but they also learned diplomacy, trade languages, and the kinds of practical skills that built communities rather than just winning battles. The curriculum emphasized protection over conquest, service over dominance. Zara tells me the morning sickness has passed, said Sharakamad, approaching through the garden paths with the careful step of a man who had learned to move gently in places where gentleness was treasured. Kale smiled, his hand moving unconsciously to rest over his heart, where joy and wonder were still too new to feel entirely real. The healers confirmed it yesterday. Another child, due before the next summer solstice, a daughter this time, perhaps? Perhaps, though boy or girl, they'll grow up in a world where their choices aren't limited by others' expectations of what they should be. It was the truth they had worked years to build, a place where strength and gentleness could coexist, where the traditions of the past could be honored without becoming prisons for the future. Children who grew up in New Haven learned to fight if they chose to be warriors, to heal if they were called to medicine, to trade if commerce was their gift, to create if art moved their souls. Most importantly, they learned that love was not a weakness to be hidden, but a strength to be celebrated. They saw it in the way their leaders treated each other, in the way disputes were settled with words rather than blades, in the way strangers were welcomed rather than feared. The other settlements are sending delegations again, Sheikh Ahmed mentioned, settling onto a stone bench that had been positioned to take advantage of the garden's morning light. Word of what you've built here has spread to places we've never even heard of. Good, Cal replied, lifting Amir onto his shoulders so the boy could better see the butterflies dancing among the roses. The more places that choose cooperation over conflict, the safer the world becomes for our children. As if summoned by his words, Zara emerged from the healing center, her face radiant with the particular glow that came from successful work and growing life. Her hands carried the lingering scent of healing herbs, but her smile was pure sunshine as she joined her family among the flowers that had somehow learned to bloom in the desert's heart. The morning patients are all settled, she announced, accepting Cal's kiss with the easy grace of a woman who had never doubted she was beloved. Old Mahudin's leg is healing beautifully, and little Sarah's fever broke completely. She reached up to take Amir from his father's shoulders, spinning him around until he giggled with delight. As she did, the desert roses released their perfume into the morning air, their impossible beauty serving as daily proof that love could indeed transform the most barren places into gardens of wonder. Our love will protect the weak, Cal said softly, updating his original vow to reflect everything they had learned about the true nature of strength. And our strength will nurture love, Zara replied, completing the promise that had become their shared truth. In the distance, a caravan appeared on the horizon, more travelers seeking what they had built in this valley between the oases. They would be welcomed, fed, healed if necessary, and sent on their way carrying stories of the place where a warrior's strength and a healer's gentleness had proven that even the desert could bloom when tended by hands that understood the true meaning of protection.